Good afternoon. My name is David Saab and I look after the Business Alliance tier of membership within the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, working with some of the larger global multinationals and universities located within the Thames Valley. The Thames Valley Chamber is one of 53 accredited chambers with the British Chamber of Commerce and the second largest in attracting foreign direct investment. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, looking at returning to work in light of government guidelines and advice issued by the Health and Safety Executive. I'm delighted to introduce Alan Davies, partner at BDB Pitmans in Reading, an award-winning top 60 UK law firm. Alan advises businesses on health and safety regulatory compliance issues and defence of investigations and prosecutions. Alan reviews the nature and extent of employers' obligations as they plan for and execute a safe return to work and how to comply with their health and safety duties. Before I hand over to Alan, we welcome questions which Alan will address at the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A box to post any questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Alan.
Thanks very much, David, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my name is Alan Davies, so I'm a partner in the BDB Pitmans insurance team at the Reading office. We've got offices in Southampton and London and Cambridge, and we're a full service law firm with 76 partners and almost 400 staff. And this afternoon I'd like to talk to you about the employer's obligations for returning staff to work, and I'll be dealing with the legal framework and the employer's health and safety obligations for COVID-19 return to work. I'm just attempting to move my slides forward here, but there is some hesitancy with that, so please bear with me. David says we'll be dealing with questions at the end, and in the talk I'll be talking about the implications for COVID-19, dealing with risk assessments, control measures, and personal protective equipment, COVID-19 guidance, and penalties for breach. As you may have seen, there's been a great deal of press coverage from the HSE and the government, and it's been difficult for employers to keep up to date with all that has gone on.
Alan, shall I have a go at doing the slides?
If you could, David, it seems to be sticking at my end. Yes.
No problem at all. This is the fun that we have with current technology, and I'm sure all of our guests will be chuckling to themselves. If you just let me know when you'd like the next slide, I will go on to it. And
yes, please do carry on.
Okay.
Mary.
I will say goodbye and mute my mic, and we'll talk in the Q&A.
Okay, thanks very much. So I've covered most of this already, yeah, finishing up with a few words about penalties for breach. And it's worth bearing in mind that the Health and Safety Executive and local authorities do have the ability to make unannounced calls on businesses to check their health and safety compliance. So it is always a good idea to make sure that your documentation is up to date, and that includes risk assessments. So risk assessments is something which I'll be coming on to in a moment. Could we try the next slide, David, please? So the legal framework, as an employer, you must protect people from harm. This is obviously fundamental. There is a common law duty and also a statutory duty, and this takes the form of the Health and Safety at Work Act in 1974, whereby under Section 2 there is the obligation to ensure a safe working place for your employees, and under Section 3 for dealing with other persons affected by the business, so obviously members of the public and visitors to the premises. And under the management of health and safety at work regulations, employers must undertake risk assessments of work activities that may have a risk of injury. And under these regulations, the minimum that employers must do is identify what could cause injury or illness in the business, which are the hazards, decide how likely it is that someone could be harmed and how seriously, and that is the risk. Then one must take action to eliminate the hazard, or if this isn't possible, then to control the risk. Now obviously employers and other organisations should already have this very much firmly in place. Now, dealing with the implications of COVID-19 risk assessments, this is going to be in addition to the existing duties and the work practices that employers have already got in place. So this could be the risk assessments covering anything from slips and trips, manual handling, to working at height. So the COVID-19 risk assessments, and you don't need to eliminate all risks, but you must do everything reasonably practicable to protect your employees from harm. That means balancing the level of risk against the measures needed to control the real risk in terms of expense, time and resources. And so in general terms, if by way of example, there was a tripping hazard recognised in the workplace through a piece of carpeting that was loose and presented a hazard, that would be noted obviously in the risk assessment, but it would not be proportionate or reasonable for the employer to go to the expense of having the whole area recarpeted. So under the COVID-19 position, employers are required to consult with their workforce. This is done with a union representative, or if there is no union representative, then to a safety representative chosen by the workforce. Now the risk assessments I'll come on to in a moment, but it is important to remember that it's not the risk assessments themselves that should be published on the website, but the results. So that could be done in summary form. David, could you move on to the next slide? Thank you. It's identifying potential hazards. So the clear potential hazard during COVID-19 is exposure to and spread of the virus as a result of the work activities. And once the potential hazards have been identified, control measures should be specific to the results of the risk assessment. So control measures, examples of these control measures are set out here. So obviously ensuring hand washing in accordance with guidance, cleaning and disinfectant of equipment and services, increased hygiene practices, making hand sanitizers readily available, and importantly, clear and concise signage at all entrance and exit points, detailing the health and safety procedures in place. Obviously, also maintaining social distancing, currently 2 meters, although that might be reduced in the near future. An important point is staggering shifts and reduced numbers of workers on the site. That's an important consideration. And for many, the first option has been considering working from home, and the safe working from home, about which I'll talk later on. Another control measure is the need to provide information to employees in relation to coronavirus and what the organisation is doing about it in the workplace. Many employers have already got well developed a number of different back to work policies dealing with their working practices after liaison with the various workforce representatives. They would need also to introduce a reporting procedure for symptoms and sending home employees immediately if they are developing symptoms. And one must also ensure availability of appropriate PPE, although this is usually as a last resort in the process of the risk assessments.
Alan, if I could just interrupt and welcome our participants back after our technical fault. I can see that a couple of hands are raised. May I encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask questions, please, and we'll ask Alan to address those at the end. Thank you. I will continue on with the next slide.
So what we have here is just a general template for an office-based business, giving an idea of what a potential generic COVID-19 workplace risk assessment would look like. Many of you are probably familiar with these types of risk assessment documents. And so on the left-hand column, one has contamination through shared facilities, which would be a potential hazard. The potential impact in the next column as to who might be harmed and how, what the risk of infection would amount to, and obviously that's one of the most serious impacts that could happen in the workplace. And one also has to consider the impact through visitors to the premises, cleaners, contractors, drivers, and vulnerable groups, and anybody basically who comes into contact with the workplace. So in the next column, we've got the current control measures, which includes hand washing facilities, as you can imagine, frequent cleaning and disinfecting of equipment and surfaces that are touched, and ensuring that social distancing is adhered to in accordance with the advice by Public Health England. Now the risk level, that's to be assessed by the assessor, and that in this example is currently left blank. And then in the last column, there's action to be taken. And here we've got employees to be reminded on a regular basis about the hand washing procedure. And then there's provision for additional hand washing facilities. And of course, posters, leaflets, and other materials being displayed in the workplace. In the next slide, we've got an example of the risk assessment matrix. And so this is how the assessor would make a decision about where to place the risk in terms of low risk or medium risk or high risk. And obviously the boxes on the right hand side give an indication of what actions need to be done if, once the assessment has been undertaken, So clearly with the high risk, if it falls into red, and this is like a traffic light system, then that work procedure should not be proceeded with at all and must cease immediately. With the medium risk, then that might be tolerable in the short term, but only if there are further control measures to mitigate the risk being planned and introduced. And then if the work procedure provides a low risk, then that is generally acceptable. But as ever, if there's anything that one can be doing to reduce that risk level even further, then that should be encouraged. And we'll now look at a further part of the risk assessment. And so this is just a continuation of the previous document, but with that knowledge in mind, then the risk level would be put into the fourth column by the person undertaking the risk assessment. And this hazard deals with workplace access, and obviously the people who may be affected by this are all employees, visitors, contractors to the workplace. And the control measures are then set out in the central section, and that could take the form of reviewing work schedules to consider whether reduced hours would help reduce the risk of potential risk, and working from home, where to reduce the number of workers on site at any one time, and relocating workers to other tasks. Also redesigning processes in the workplace to ensure that social distancing can remain unaffected. And again, we have clear and concise signage at all the entrance and exit points in the building. And on the right-hand side, we have the similar actions to take place as we did in the first potential hazard risk assessment. And other things that employees could do would be to consider additional parking, finance towards travel, so that they can avoid public transport, and measures to be put in place for use of the lifts, such as one person at a time, or if it's a lift of sufficient size, then to put markers on the floor and signage in the lift. And so we're now going to have a look at some PPE. So any form of PPE should be a last resort in the risk assessment process after the hazards have been assessed. And if you are going to be providing PPE to employees free of charge, then that has to be of sufficient quality. Choose products which are CE marked in accordance with the PPE regulations 2002 and I think also 2013. And it is worth noting that the HSE provide an excellent daily update of issues which concern health and safety in the workplace, and they provide bulletins which include PPE notifications, such as KN95 face masks. That was the latest bulletin that they issued, warning that they had come across hundreds of thousands, if not a million or more, face masks which did not provide adequate protection. In other words, they were fake. So do ensure that appropriate CE marked PPE is used. So if it is required, then you must ensure that the PPE items are compatible when used together, and instruct and train people how to use it. And the HSE again have provided very useful links on their website, giving employers the ability to train their remote workforce before they go back into work. So there are videos, for example, instructing how people can apply face masks, and it has to be appropriately fitted and properly fitted to the face to be useful. And so it's a very useful resource. Obviously, employers should ensure that the PPE is properly maintained and defects are reported, and obviously ensure that PPE is cleaned and disposed of after use. So, staying COVID-19 secure, the HSE have made available a poster which can be displayed, and must be displayed in fact, in the workplace, confirming compliance with the government guidelines. And this sets out a declaration, 5-step declaration, as you can see, and it confirms that a COVID-19 risk assessment has been undertaken and the results have been shared with the people who are working in the workplace, and that you've got appropriate cleaning, hand washing and hygiene procedures in line with guidance, taken all reasonable steps to help people work from home. You've taken all reasonable steps to maintain a 2-metre distance in the workplace, and where people cannot be 2 metres apart, they've done everything practical to manage a transition risk. Now, this needs to be signed by the employer and dated, and details of who to contact if there are any questions. And this needs to be prominently displayed in the workplace. You may be familiar with RIDDOR, which is the Reporting of Injuries, Diseases, Dangerous Occurrences regulations, shortened to RIDDOR 2013, which imposes duties on employers, self-employed and people in control of work premises to report serious workplace accidents, occupational diseases and certain specified dangerous occurrences. So specified dangerous occurrences will include fractures and even scalping, I think, is one of the limited number of specified dangerous occurrences, and thank goodness we don't get too many of those. And also non-specific, which includes injuries resulting in more than 7 days absence from work. The updated RIDDOR reporting concerning COVID-19, the Health and Safety Executive has advised that there is no requirement under RIDDOR to report incidents of disease or death of members of the public, patients, care home residents or service users from COVID-19. The reporting requirements relating to cases and deaths of COVID-19 under RIDDOR only apply to occupational exposure, so exposure within the workplace. As to what to report, an accident or incident at work has or could have led to the release or escape of coronavirus. That must be reported as a dangerous occurrence. A person at work, an employee or worker, has been diagnosed as having COVID-19 attributed to occupational exposure to coronavirus. This must be reported as a case of disease. If a worker dies as a result of occupational exposure to coronavirus, then that's got to be reported as a work-related death due to exposure to a biological agent. As to health and safety for remote working, by law, employers are responsible for the health and safety of all employees, including those working from home on a temporary or permanent basis. So even though the workers are working from home, you still have the same duties and responsibilities as if they were under your roof. HSE have advised that employers should consider how they'll keep in touch with employees, what work they'll be doing and for how long, and how that can be done safely. And in fact, the HSE have issued this advice on probably about 3 or 4 different occasions, and they have changed tack slightly from that which had been on their website a week ago, which said that employers must consider. And so that imposes a legal duty, but now they've amended it again to put it back to what it was before that, to an advisory duty. Anyway, and the other item that they should consider is whether to put control measures in place to protect their employees. So employers should continue to remind employees of the Public Health England advice, particularly hygiene and cleaning procedures of equipment and home working surfaces. Got to keep in touch with the home workers and ensure regular contact to make sure they are healthy and safe. So regular phone calls to them, regular emails, Zoom calls, and ask them how they are coping, consider the work schedules that they're under, and maintain regular contact. This is important so that you can recognise signs of stress, for example, as early as possible, and do all that you can to address those concerns. Now, for those working at home permanently or on a long-term basis using display screen equipment, known as DSE, as I'm sure you know, employers should engage with them about carrying out home working and home workstation assessments. So, as to remote working with the use of DSE, there are simple steps which employees can take to reduce the risks from display screen work, and that includes breaking up long spells of DSE work with rest breaks or changes in activity. And this is something that ought to be covered by guidance which is issued by the employers to the employees, and that should be adhered to. Employers should have regular discussions, as I mentioned, with the employees and discuss whether additional steps are needed, where the employee reports, for example, aches, pains, etc., related to their temporary DSE arrangements. Any complaint of aches and pains, particularly in the upper limbs, in the tendons of the arms, could be an early indication of RSI, repetitive strain injury, and consequently, anything that is flagged up to that effect should send a signal to the employer that they need to review the nature and extent of their employees' work to ensure that their symptoms are alleviated and any assistance by way of equipment can be provided to them. So where employers decide to make working from home arrangements permanent, then of course they should carry out full workplace assessments. So moving on to the guidance which has been issued from the UK government, that is to carry out the COVID-19 risk assessment. This is something that the employers must do. Develop cleaning, hand washing and hygiene procedures. They've got to help people when they work from home, as I've outlined, and maintain 2-metre social distancing wherever possible. And where people cannot be 2 meters apart. They have to manage the transmission risk. So when they come back to work, consider using screens to separate the employees, stagger arrival and departure times, and work out how best to reduce the number of people in the workplace at any one time. Do they actually need to be there at that time? And make sure that you adhere to HSE advice, which, as I say, changes quite often on a daily basis. So non-essential shops can now open, and the latest advice to retailers includes limiting opening hours, limiting the number of customers in the store to comply with social distancing requirements, encouraging customers to use hand sanitizer on entry into the premises, and obviously hand washing facilities, and to try and avoid products whilst browsing. They're required to keep the customer restaurants and cafes closed until further notice, unless they're offering food for consumption off the premises. Fitting rooms should be closed wherever possible, and where fitting rooms are essential for key workers buying critical clothing, they should be cleaned very frequently, typically within in between each use. And the restocking of shelves, that should be done outside of opening hours wherever possible. Now, it's a good idea, obviously, to keep your insurers advised of any significant changes in your working patterns and practices. So restaurants now only providing home deliveries to their customers should ensure that they have adequate policy coverage, because this is probably something that was not envisaged when the risk was placed on the market, and the insurers may wish to consider whether it's appropriate for them to review coverage and the premium. And so that's a conversation that you should have through your brokers. They'll act as intermediaries between yourselves and the insurers. And insurers, if they're considering a claim made during the COVID-19 lockdown period, then they may consider if the company's health and safety practices have actually been complied with in accordance with government and HSE guidance, and good practice has been adhered to. Because if not, then that might be a consideration when they come to consider granting policy indemnity in respect of the claim that's been presented to them, if, for example, it's a workplace injury. Dealing with something about enforcement actions, if there are going to be any enforcement actions, then that will be undertaken by the HSE or the local authority. The HSE is the principal investigating authority, and they have a number of regional offices all over the country. The local authorities also have the statutory power to undertake investigations. They have about 380 different offices around the country. And it's important to realise that there may be unannounced visits from these authorities. Often employers have good relationships with their local authorities through previous contacts and getting their businesses established. So you may have a point of local contact, which is helpful when it comes to dealing with any sort of HSE inquiry or local authority inquiry, because then you have a face to put to a name, and they were more likely to be in contact with you in advance to make an appointment to come around rather than just turn up unannounced. But in this current climate, with unions calling for HSE and local authorities to take stringent action if there are any breaches of health and safety law, then it would be wise to prepare your documents, your health and safety Bible of documents, so that it's in good form, ready for any inspection. Now, what they may do is issue a notice of material breach by way of letter. If there is not anything on their inspection that causes immediate concern to them. If there is something that is of major concern, then they would probably go straight to issuing an improvement notice requiring that the work practice in question is improved to their satisfaction and all risk of injury eliminated within a certain period of time, such as 14 days. Or if it is a very serious and clear breach of health and safety practice, then they could issue a prohibition notice. And that's obviously very serious for the business. That means that there has to be an immediate cessation of that work practice. Now, that can be subject to an appeal, of course, and rather oddly, the appeal is heard by the employment tribunal. There's also the possibility of, in serious breaches, of prosecution of the company and or its directors. And clearly the penalties for serious breach can be very significant. There's been a marked increase in the high level of fines now being imposed upon companies following the sentencing guideline review of 4 years ago, and we've seen a number of high-profile prosecutions of serious breaches running into millions of pounds. There's also reputational damage to be considered, and also fees for intervention, which is something that has been brought in, whereby the HSE can charge £129 an hour for their time dealing with the investigation into the breach, and so that can quickly run up thousands of pounds. Now, I mentioned earlier about the HSE website being a fountain of information, and there's so much guidance to be seen out there. I've put here a series of links taking you to all sorts of helpful documents. The Working Safely guidance document, which is a 17-page document, is the first one, and various other links all the way through to the health and safety risk assessment template. And that is all. Thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry we had the technical difficulties earlier. But David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alan. And may I say thank you for so much vital information and guidance in your presentation. It's been tricky with the technology today, so thank you for bearing with us, participants. I have seen some hands raised. We have received some questions. Those of you that still have some questions to enter, please do so on the Q&A box, and we will attempt to answer them now. The first question is, we have found that N95 masks are simply not available at this time. Where do we stand as an employer if we cannot get hold of them?
Okay, the KN95 mask is a particular mask and one of many. The NHS had indicated some while ago that they did not advocate use of that mask for their employees, and so they've been using different masks. And as to availability, I would suggest perhaps making contact with local trading standards office to see what the latest best advice is as to the suitability of masks for employees, depending on the particular work practices in question. Obviously, if you're just in an office environment, the requirement to have a mask is quite different to that if you're in dealing with something in the manufacturing practices, and therefore the type of mask would differ considerably. But I think contacting local trading standards would be an appropriate recourse.
Okay, excellent. Our second question. Hi, Alan. I run a performing arts education program, and usually our students are in and out of physical classes such as dance, workouts, and then go into changing rooms to get dressed. Given that they are undertaking physical activity and consequently sweating, and then getting changed in communal changing rooms, are there additional legislative issues, or is it just dealing with these things as part of the RA? Haven't figured out how to deal with this yet, other than halving class sizes. Thanks for any advice.
Yes, I'm not aware of any particular extra guidance relating to performing arts, but do bear in mind that the HSE have provided sectional advice. So they've given specific advice to eight different sectors, including manufacturing and in a care environment and transport, things like that. So it is worth having a look on the HSE website for any specific advice for your requirement. But the general requirement will be to ensure that risk assessments are undertaken in respect of the particular activities in place, and halving class sizes is clearly a sensible measure to consider alongside all the other guidance. And so far as communal changing rooms are concerned, that would need to be carefully assessed, and the social distancing issues would need to be looked into in some detail, I think, on that scenario.
Yeah, makes sense, Alan. Okay, we have another question. If an employer has taken all reasonable steps to protect staff, yet they still contract COVID-19 in the workplace, is the employer liable?
Good question. One begs it begs another question of how sure an employee could be that they got it in the workplace. That's a sort of causational issue, because clearly there would be a duty on any employee considering making a claim of that nature, and a claim for damages, civil damages. The onus of proof would be on them to prove that it must have arisen from a occupational workplace exposure. That's quite a high level to achieve, because, as I say, there are so many other possibilities where contraction could have occurred. I think insofar as the duty of the employer is concerned, with having taken all reasonable steps as outlined, and put all the protective measures in place, undertaking the COVID-19 risk assessment, etc., If they've done that, then it's difficult to see how they could be criticised. But it is important to make sure that it's reviewed on a daily basis. So there's an extra burden of responsibility, I think, on behalf of the employer to ensure that workplace assessments are being adhered to by the employees. And one possibility to assist employers even further would be to consider, in consultation with the workforce, using an attestation document, an attestation clause, whereby employees are required to declare that they have been COVID-free for a period of 14 days at least before they come back to work, and they haven't been in contact or living with anybody with that, with the COVID-19, and they could be asked to sign a declaration to that effect. I think that would be a reasonable step to take in order to preserve the safety of everybody in the workplace. And if the workforce agree through consultation to that process, then I think that would be a good way for the employers to safeguard themselves against claims of that nature.
Excellent. Just a shout out to all attendees. We apologise for the echo and the noise on the microphone. Poor Alan had to change his system last minute, a few minutes before we went live. We thank you for bearing with us. I know that the audio is not perfect, but the topic is. Alan, I have a few more questions. Are you okay if I continue to ask you a few more? Okay, so Alan, do the COVID-19 procedure and risk assessment, does the COVID-19 procedure and risk assessment requirements apply to all employers, however large or small the employer might be? Example, whether a small business of less than 5 employees has same duties as a much larger multinational company. I do believe that we lost Alan for a moment there. Alan, can you hear me? Are we back on? I'm just see if you can unmute. There we go. Oh, try that again, Alan. Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Alan?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Sorry we lost
my that's right. I think my wife would like that facility to mute and unmute.
No,
so
no
yes, I missed part of what was being asked there, but I think it was does the size of the workforce have any influence on the procedures to be put in place? I think that yeah. Going back a step, every business needs to have a health and safety policy, and every business must have one that's written down. But if you've got under 5 employees, then you don't have to write it down, and it would be prudent for a workforce of any size to have a COVID-19 risk assessment. It's the risk of injury that needs to be assessed, and under the health and the management of health and safety at work regulations, then that risk assessment does need to be carried out by a competent person. That
Excellent.
Competent person could be somebody with experience, or you could even have that delegated to an outside representative.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, another question, Alan. Where we can't have 2 meter social distancing due to face-to-face desk constraints, should we be looking at putting up screens between desks?
Absolutely, yes. First of all, I would advocate not having face-to-face desks. It would be better if you're constrained by space and you do need to have workers in that situation, than to have them working side by side rather than opposite each other. And if that doesn't lend itself to safe working and proper working, then certainly appropriate screens of a thickness and height should be installed between the desks.
Excellent. Next question. What do you recommend is published on the website? Whole RA or a brief summarising statement?
A brief summarising statement is perfectly adequate. There's no obligation to publish risk assessments themselves on the website, but it's the results of the risk assessments which have been undertaken that is necessary to go on the website, and it should be published on the website at the same level as the other important information concerning the company.
Okay. We have two more questions. First question, do we need to ask employees to sign to confirm they are happy with the measure we have taken and that they agree to follow them?
Yes, I think that's a safe and sensible precaution on behalf of the employers. As I said earlier, it's important to engage with the workforce, take them along with you, explaining what the measures are that are being proposed to safeguard their safety and get their agreement. And as part of that process, I would expect that in advance of a return to work, there would be some online training provided, perhaps by emails. Again, HSE have got some good material on their websites about returning to work and remote training. So it's a good idea to have a look at some of that material when you're considering ways and means by which you can protect the workforce and also yourselves as employers. And as I mentioned earlier, also about the attestation clause, by the same token, you could ask for a receipt from the employees that they have seen and understood the new training that you're able to send them.
Excellent. Our last question, Alan. If someone contracts the virus and have been at work, do we need to close the premises entirely?
Good question again. I would say that if somebody has contracted symptoms whilst being in the workplace, then they should be sent home immediately. It depends on the nature and extent of the workplace to some extent as to what the response action is. But I would say that in the average office environment, it would be prudent to close the office on a temporary basis to ensure that there's a deep clean undertaken. And then once that's been undertaken and the position reassessed, then the rest of the workforce can come back to the workplace. In the meantime, perhaps they could continue their work remotely.
Excellent. Alan, thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us today on behalf of the Chamber and our audience. Thank you. I must say that, you know, we had a catastrophe at the beginning with Alan's system, and like a trooper, he forged on and joined us again, and we've muddled through, even though we realise the sound quality has not been perfect. But I'm sure everyone attending will agree that this is such a content-rich presentation. Alan, are we allowed to share your presentation with the participants today? Would that be okay?
Yes, by all means. Yes, do send the slides. Although perhaps we can try and do some editing on the webinar
Don't worry.
For those looking back on the recording.
Yeah, absolutely. My marketing department will sparkle it up and make it absolutely fine. So we see on the final couple of slides, BDB Pitmans, how we can help. So, Alan, I don't know whether you want to just sort of comment on that, because what's important for our attendees to know about this?
Thanks, David. Yes, just in brief, so we can advise on all aspects of health and safety regulatory compliance in the workplace and for organisations from the outset, basically. So that covers helping with development of health and safety policies, and also the health and safety statement, the statutory statement, providing advice and representation for clients in health and safety investigations, either by HSE or local authorities. That can include sitting in with interviews under caution and advising the clients on how best to deal with matters which are raised against them. And we have found that working collaboratively with the company and those which have been raising any concerns, the authorities, is often a good way, rather than putting up barriers, working collaboratively with them, understanding what their concerns are with any breaches that they may have identified, and working closely so that we can satisfy the desires of the authorities, so that there is no prosecution resulting. We've done that on many times. We also deal with defence of any personal injury claims and advising on insurance covers and disputes.
Excellent. We have a slide here with Alan's details. If you'd like to scribble down Alan's email address and phone number. As I said, we will be distributing slides, so Alan's details will be on the presentation. In closing, I think we'll all agree that we're facing unprecedented challenges, and that's why the Thames Valley Chamber, along with our partners in the British Chamber of Commerce, have launched a business continuity toolkit aimed at ensuring you have access to one single portal. So please have a look at our website if you'd like further information on that. It's updated regularly, and just like Alan's presentation, really content rich. And if you would like any further information about the Chamber of Commerce, please contact myself. We would love to help any in the Thames Valley as we work together. And that's the end of our webinar today. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, participants, for joining us. And we hope to see you another time. Thanks again.
Many thanks. Bye.
Bye.